TalkBack. I'm Sheila Horvitz, and during this coronavirus time, when we're all at home and following our social distancing, I'm happy to do these live stream shows through Comcast, and we're on Facebook Live, Comcast Channel 14, and then it will be posted on the page, and it will also be shown on Comcast TV on many occasions during the next several weeks. I'm so happy today to have someone who everyone in this district knows. For 20 years, he was our congressman, and before that, he was active in the state Senate and the State House of Representatives, Sam Gejdenson. Hi, Sam. It's good to see you today.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. And we were chatting. We're all doing well. And you're in Basra, Connecticut, which is where you grew up on the farm with your parents, right? And I know I want to go into the history that we have and the history that you lived through. But before that, I want to talk about a law that was just passed yesterday by the Senate. The House of Representatives has already passed it. It's called the Never Again Education Act, and it's about bringing Holocaust education programs to the country through the United States Holocaust Museum in DC. And we know that you are a child of Holocaust survivors, and as a matter of fact, you were not even born in this country. So talk about that for a few minutes. You were born where?
It's hard to think of yourself as a child at this age, but I was born in a UN refugee camp in Germany after World War II. My parents were from Vilnius, which was then part of Poland, then part of Russia, and is now part of Lithuania. My father was from what was Poland and fought in the Polish army and then in the Russian army, hid in the woods, was hidden by several Catholic families, is the only reason he survived. And now that's part of Belarus, which is one of the last kind of totally dictators in the region. But the importance of studying the Holocaust is we don't learn our lesson if we just apply it to what happened during World War II. We have to make sure we understand wherever this happens, whether it's in Africa or Asia. You know, there were 1,000,006 Cambodians killed under Pol Pot. You know, in Yugoslavia, there was mass slaughter of Muslims. And so the lesson has to be that we understand that we can use this information to see it wherever it happens in the world and not just this one historic event. So that's where it's very important. And I think a lot of people think it's only this one instance. Well, it's happened. This is one of the largest instances, clearly, and one where the entire resources of the government of a modern state were organized to annihilate people, not just Jews, but also homosexuals, people with differing political views, Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Jews are mentioned most often because it was 50% of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe, of the world, was annihilated by Hitler. So the important lesson here is to learn and use this in dealing with new situations, not just historical situations.
Well, and of course, this act is trying to correct what had been happening in many school systems around the country where they didn't have information about World War II and the Holocaust in their curriculums. And we're trying to bring that back and also go against the prevalence of a lot of the Holocaust deniers that, you know, have been cropping up around the world in the last 20 years or so. So this is a push to really make people remember what happened. And of course, the act does talk also about the gypsies and the homosexuals and the communists and all of the other people who were not the Aryan race that Hitler wanted to, you know, to preserve. So when you were growing up, did your parents talk to you about their experiences? When did you realize that you were different, that you were a kid who had a history that was different from others?
Well, I think we kind of knew, although my parents, you know, healed remarkably well for what they went through. And they didn't really talk about it. You didn't have fireside chats about what happened. But for instance, one of the things we knew was that almost on a monthly basis, we sent packages back to the old Catholic woman, two families, that helped my father during the war, that hid him from the Gestapo. My father's village, after Pearl Harbor sometime, the Gestapo showed up, rounded up all the Jews, and killed all but about six. Six, like my father, hid, ran away, and survived. And so after that, these two incredibly courageous Catholic families Polish, now Belarusian Catholic families, hid my father. And the risk was not just that they would kill the parents, they'd kill all 8 children if, of course, they found them hiding somebody of the Jewish faith.
Right. So that's an important part of your history, and I'm sure it informed your career when you went into politics. But so let's go into that. You were the congressman from the 2nd District from 1980 to 2000, 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you and I met in 1972. I want you to talk about that a little bit. You were chairing the George McGovern campaign, and the offices were in the building in Norwich, Connecticut, which was the bank building that soon became the offices of Brown, Jacobs, and Jewett and Ladone, where I started to work in 1978. So talk about that time and the kind of thankless task we had to try and get George McGovern elected. Go ahead.
It was a very tough election, obviously, but it also shows you how things changed. I don't want to make your show totally political, but you know, I used to think back and think Nixon was the worst president, you know, and although when you look at Nixon now in historic context, he created the EPA. He was for providing a direct payment to poor people so they could get along. And so while there were battles with Nixon, he obviously had some very disturbing aspects to his character, including the criminality of the break-in. By comparison, what this president's doing, he actually comes out looking better.
Okay, well, we'll get into him toward the end. I want to go a little chronologically, and we'll get to who I call he who shall not be named, but you mentioned the name, so we'll get into it. But in 1972, do you remember going to Constitution Plaza? George McGovern actually came to Hartford, and he made a speech there in Constitution Plaza, and we went with our 2 little kids in the strollers, and he mentioned in 1972 the word Watergate. No one else cared about it or thought about it in 1972, and Nixon won overwhelmingly. Nobody thought about it.
No, people, Nixon supporters were like offended if you raised Watergate and that something illegal happened there. They were in complete denial, and it was not till well after the election till the story came out.
Right, exactly. That's what I meant. We all went into that election, and Nixon won a resounding victory. It was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, without a doubt.
Without a doubt. And it was a shame because George McGovern was a really fine human being, and he had been a patriot in World War II, and we didn't give him credit for all of that.
The irony, of course, and my favorite picture during that campaign, George McGovern, who came from a farm state, was one of the fathers of food stamps. And of course, this benefited both his constituencies, farmers getting rid of excess food products, and his political beliefs of helping poor people. So George McGovern, father of food stamps, a program that takes, and the WIC program that takes excess crops and helps poor people make it through their daily lives with enough sustenance. Well, there's a picture, and it ran all over the news. George McGovern sees a woman buying her groceries with food stamps. And George McGovern goes over and introduces himself. He says, "I'm Senator McGovern." And she stops him right there and says, "Senator McGovern, can you get government off my back?" And here's a woman who's surviving because she's getting food stamps. And we have a lot of that today. You often see state and town and federal employees who think they should be anti-government. Now, we can always try to make government better, but it's the government that makes this society run. All the people in it, but also a structure that makes things work right.
Exactly. And that's a perfect segue into Ronald Reagan, because he, of all people, he took that welfare queen or the person that took the food stamps, that took the help, and he victimized them. He made them bad. He said there's only one thing wrong with government, and that's government. The only problem with government is government, something like that. And he made us feel that government didn't work for all of us.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the constant myth of the right wing in America. And while government, of course, makes mistakes, and we're human, so we're not perfect, it really is the pulling together of society that made us strong. If the early settlers had said, no, we're individuals, we're going to do it on our own, they would have died, in the early stages of this country. It was coming together, forming a government, first getting rid of the British, and then building the greatest nation on earth. So we really have to understand the difference between government can make mistakes and that government's the enemy. Government's not the enemy. It tries to do the right job most of the time. And in most cases, you look at the state of Connecticut, I think the current governor's doing a phenomenal job, especially through this. Here he is taken over during the worst crisis we've had, health crisis, in the history of our state and the country. And he's going by the science, he's making the right decisions. And it's really impressive to see how he's trying to do best for the individuals so they can go back to work, and also for the safety of the country.
Right. I'm wondering if you would talk about this analysis that I think that until Reagan, both parties went to Washington to try and do good. Maybe they had a different philosophy about how to do it. But now it seems the Democrats go because they want to do good. They want to help people. They want to pass laws that'll improve the lives of people. And yes, there's a balance between freedom and the government, of course. But the Republicans seem to go to Washington to get government off our backs, to stop everything, to say no, to deny. And I think to make sure everything gets privatized. That's what they want to do. They're still fighting the.
Well, they obviously want to enrich. Their goal is to enrich their friends, without any doubt. But a perfect example is Mitch McConnell telling our states to go bankrupt, which would only make the cost of governing and providing services more expensive. And his state gets more subsidies than most of the states in the country. And so here you have New York and Connecticut that actually send money to the federal government, and we have wealthier per capita citizens because we have better economies, and his state has to receive funds from the government because they're not. It's mindless assaults on what's the greatest country in the world. And unless we want to turn this over to some other foreign nation, then we got to get serious about working together to make this the most successful country in the world, as it has been traditionally.
Okay, so let's go back to 1980. That was when you first got elected. And of course, Ronald Reagan was president then. And was the atmosphere different? Is it true that he and Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, were able to reach agreements? And how did you feel working in that Congress during that time?
Well, what Tip used to say to us, and Tip was a solid Democrat and, an old Irish Democrat, and he used to say to us, he's our president and we have to show him respect. And, that kind of attitude, starting with Gingrich, really ended. The kind of personal assaults on the President of the United States, on other members of Congress, the dishonesty in many of their statements. It's just insane what's been going on, and it's now gotten even worse. And I think part of the solution has to be that we all have to do a better job as citizens to do the research to understand what the facts are.
Well, isn't that the problem? We have what we call alternative facts today. We have so many. It used to be we had ABC, CBS, and NBC. We had three major outlets. We had certain newspapers. There was a kind of a common understanding about what the factual situation was, and maybe we disagreed on the solution. But now there are so many outlets. There are a million stations. There are a million newspapers online, a million pundits around. How do you get to the truth? And how easy is it for a demagogue like Trump to make people believe whatever he says?
Well, we've had demagogues before. I mean, so George Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the American Nazi Party, George Wallace, McCarthy, not Joe McCarthy, who, claimed there were communists in the State Department, but the country was strong enough to stand up to him. Now, frankly, a great general, Eisenhower, didn't stand up to Joe McCarthy. And it took quite a while for the country to stand up to him. And today it is harder because there are so many sources of information, and it's very hard to figure out what's true. I mean, one of the perfect examples is this drug the president keeps promoting. A lot of the president's supporters keep thinking it's a great drug. It may be a great drug for some things, but if you have the virus and they give you the drug, I think there's just been a study around the world of the effect something like 30% more deaths occur if you're taking the drug while you have the virus. Yet, if you talk to a solid Trump person, they're still committed to it. So it is a fight, especially when the White House is the center of a lot of disinformation.
Well, exactly. So when did this happen where science becomes politicized? We never had that before. Now between climate science and this issue, we have people who just say, I don't believe the scientists. Or I have people say to me who are kind of right wingers, where did you get that article, Sheila? Oh, I read it in the Washington Post. Oh, well, then you have to discount it.
Right.
I read it in the New York Times. Oh, you have to discount it.
Well, first of all, those are excellent papers, and they have a long history of telling the truth about things. But, you know, it's just like the virus. The countries that listened to the scientists and shut down first had the best results. And the states who responded the fastest and listened to the science also are doing the best. And the states that ignored things are now having explosions in the number of cases. Now, I think, again, as individuals, we can't just lean back and say, well, there's too much information today and I can't figure. You know what? If you look at scientific information, you listen to scientists, you know, if you listen to Dr. Fauci, who has a record of decades of fighting AIDS and other outbreaks in the United States, that's somebody you got to depend on. So when you have a choice of people who are kind of shooting from the hip without any facts, and you have somebody like a scientist, a doctor of Dr. Fauci's stature, it should be pretty easy to figure out who you have to listen to.
Yeah. Let's get back a little more history. So after Reagan, of course, you were there when just Bush the first, George H. Bush, came into
We're almost like a monarchy here, yes.
1988 to 1992. Is there anything that stands out during that period of time for you?
Well, Bush the first was a decent guy, controlled by the right wing of his party. So he got in trouble with his party because he ended up supporting a tax increase, which was necessary. One of the things that we've known historically is you cut taxes during a recession like we have now. The mistake was giving corporations and billionaires big tax breaks when Trump came in, money they used to buy up their own stocks and enrich themselves, and not to stimulate an economy that's in trouble. So George Bush was a decent guy. He was actually pro-choice before the Republican Party abandoned women's rights completely. And so he ended up, you know, kind of frozen in this netherworld where he couldn't move. But I think you hit the nail on the head. We have to sit back and listen to scientists and read the data and then make a decision. Now, you know, the people in the Midwest often denied climate change. But when you start seeing the kind of devastation from hurricanes and flooding, it starts to make sense. The hottest months and years are all in the recent past. And so if we want to leave a better planet for our children, which used to be a common position, then we have to take action. Now, some things are working just because people, not government necessarily, making the decisions. We're now generating more electricity in the United States by renewables, solar, wind, and water, than we are by coal. And about a year and a half ago, I bought an electric car, the Tesla 3. It's phenomenal. I loved cars. I grew up in East.
Oh, what happened? What happened? It looks like we may have lost the feed from Sam. We're going to wait for him to get it back. He was talking about listening to the scientists. He was talking about getting a Tesla because electricity in cars is the future that we have to work on. Let's hope that we can get him back.
I'm back.
There you are.
I was just bragging about my electric car.
Did you make sure your power source is on where you're sitting?
Yes, the power source is on. So I have a Tesla 3, And I'm a
Okay.
car nut. I've loved cars my whole life. And I bought this. It's phenomenal. It drives itself. When I'm coming down Route 2, it gets off the exit by itself. If I want to, it can pass by itself, or you can pass by just hitting your signal light. It stops by itself at stop signs. And
Wow.
it's incredibly efficient.
And will it be accessible cost-wise to the average person out there?
Well, they're coming down, and actually General Motors had something called the Bolt, which was pretty inexpensive. I mean, not cheap, and it's going to get cheaper. Battery price, the big cost for an electric car has been the battery, and they're coming up with all kinds of new batteries that don't use rare and expensive minerals. So you're going to see a lot of these cars. And I tell you, the Tesla, the acceleration is faster than any car you've ever driven. It handles great. It's just a beautiful layout in the car. I'm just thrilled with it.
Okay, I want to get back to our history march, but so we're
You don't
still
want to
back
do any
with-
more advertising for Tesla? Okay, that's
No,
fine.
you did. I think you did enough. They should pay.
I
you
don't
for
have
it.
any stock. I just want to say I have no stock in the company.
Well, after they listen to this, they'll give you a contract. So
Yeah, I don't think so.
back to George the First, as we said.
Yeah.
I just want to say, you said he was a nice guy, co-opted by the right, etc. I just want to push a little bit back on that because it ties into today. Number one, you know what he did with the Willie Horton ad where he made used racism to go against Mike Dukakis, who was the Democratic candidate. You know how he ran into a flag factory and made it seem like only Republicans were patriots and loved the flag. And Mike Dukakis was probably an ACLU card-carrying liberal, right? He demonized
the ACLU, by the way, defends all our rights, whether you're a right-winger, a left-winger, or no-winger at all. It's a very good organization. They take unpopular causes, but they do a great job.
So he did that, and he had this campaign manager, Atwood. Was it Atwood?
Yes, Atwood was a particularly bad guy.
Who had to, on his deathbed, apologize for the terrible and racist ads he did for politicians. And Bush went along with that and accepted it and took his. And then
I wasn't putting him in. I wasn't putting him in sainthood. Just compared to what we have now, he wasn't as bad.
But the one thing that connects with today is William Barr, who is our current Department of Justice, right? He was also the Attorney General under George H. Bush, and the Iran-Contra was being investigated. And Caspar Weinberger and a bunch of other guys in the Reagan-Bush administration were on the hook for maybe being criminally charged for what they did in Iran-Contra. I mean, I still think Reagan should have been charged too, but
well, he didn't know what was going on.
He took a deposition, and every other word was "I can't recall" when they deposed him. That's a really nice.
I think I believe him almost.
Okay, but at any rate, what happened was Barr recommended to George Bush that what should he do? He should pardon every one of those people from Iran-Contra.
Barr, you're correct. Barr has been a bad guy for a long time.
Let's connect that. Let's connect that to today. What's he doing today to help Trump and to help Trump politicize more than a cover-up?
The guys who are selling out America's interest to the Russians, to the Turks and others, he's now exonerating.
He's exonerating them, but he's also politicizing. He's taking the Justice Department as a cudgel against Trump's enemies, against Obama, against Biden, against everyone in the Obama administration. They're making like there's going to be a huge investigation when there's really nothing there.
And by the way, there were no scandals in 8 years of Obama. There's an hourly scandal in Trump. They can try to do whatever they want. It's not going to make a difference in history. When history looks at these dates, they're going to see a president who wasn't perfect. You know, Obama made some mistakes, but was basically an honest and decent family man who worked for what he thought was the best interest of the country and what he can do. And that's going to contrast very nicely compared to the current president.
I hope you're right.
As you said, will remain nameless.
So now let's go to, now we're in 1992. I want you to talk about your perception of Clinton and Gingrich, because they're sort of like the two. Gingrich came in as became the Speaker of the House and then was kind of deposed and had to leave. And of course, Clinton had his good and bad points. Talk about that.
Well, Gingrich was among the most unprincipled individuals that I ever dealt with. You could sit down and have a discussion with him on a subject that he might come to agreement on. He'd walk out the door and take a completely different position. You could never count on anything he said or did. He did that with fellow Republicans. He also did it with us, obviously, as well. Clinton was one of the most capable, smartest, hardworking individuals we've ever had in the presidency. No one could keep up with him. Gore was exhausted trying to keep up with Clinton, obviously. And Clinton came to Connecticut. He was in Eastern Connecticut, up and down, had a big event in Norwich where he met with went to Greenville part of Norwich and visited a pharmacy there, and EB and all over Eastern Connecticut. Very capable, very hardworking, and amazing discipline, except for in that one area where he got in trouble. But I went on one of the trips I went with him on. We went to the Middle East, and it was at a time when there was real hope for peace in the Middle East, and we were able to go to Gaza. We went to the West Bank. We went to Israel, and on the trip were people who were trying to impeach him. And the only thing, occasionally you see a little twitch in his jaw, but everything else, he was focused on his job and working hard. And it was a very hopeful period. And of course, now, like a lot of the world, and it's just a disaster in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, I think that was interesting about Clinton because, yeah, he had that flaw and it was too bad. It disappointed us that it took so many months away from good things that he could have done. It took up too much of our time. But on the other hand, he didn't seem to have the venomous anger, and certainly didn't express it in public. He had a certain grace about it, really, that differs from he who shall not be named.
Well, he was very smart. He was hardworking, very knowledgeable. When he was first elected president, within a week or so, about 10 of us were brought into the Oval Office to discuss a number of topics, one that each of us had worked on. And Clinton knew as much or more about each topic than the member of Congress who might have been working on that topic for a decade.
Wow.
And
yeah.
My favorite, one of the guys there said, well, there's $800 million in Section 8 housing. And the Republicans under Bush had tried to use that money to sell off private housing to people that couldn't afford it. We should really build more units. And when the guy finished, the president said, there was 800, they spent it down. There's now 540 million. And you're right, this is what we need to do. And he went down the list of things that each of us had worked on and knew him as well as we did.
Right, that was interesting. So now we get to 2000. You lose your race, but I wanted to ask you, there was that bombing in New York from Al-Qaeda during Clinton's time. And then when you left office in 2000, and when Bush II, or George W., who I call the shrub, I called him the younger Bush, the shrub, he came in. Did you, as a congressman in 1999, 2000, know about the potential of Al-Qaeda doing something as magnificent, unbelievable as a 9/11? Was Bush prepared with that information from the Clinton people when he came in, or does he have a lot of blame? Go ahead.
Bush had actually gotten briefed by his own people in August. This happened in September. That there were plots to use planes to attack facilities in the United States. I'm not sure the precise wording, but he had a number of briefings that raised those issues. And of course, they didn't pay attention to him. And then we saw what happened. But that could have happened on any watch. I think obviously if Clinton had been president he paid much closer attention to the briefings and facts. And of course, the president doesn't even listen to the briefings and certainly doesn't read them. I ended up, I was actually in Belarus doing election monitoring when the World Trade Center came down. And I was supposed to go to a meeting in New York, but I hadn't been back to see my wife in a little bit. So I actually came back a day early. And the rest of the group got stuck in Europe for 3 or 4 days because they shut off air traffic.
Okay. So you lived through we all lived through the 2008. What's your feeling about how that went? We know that we had Congressman Courtney. We know that at first he voted against the first package that was going to bail out a lot of the businesses. Remember, how would you have dealt with that if you were in Congress that time?
And when are you talking about?
2008. No, around the crisis, the
2008.
financial crisis in 2008. Yeah.
Well, I don't remember the exact details, but I can tell you this. I think Joe Courtney is the best congressman we've had in the history of the 2nd District, including the person you're talking to now. He's just doing a phenomenal job, and I really have never found anything that I can criticize him on.
Excellent. I just had him on a couple of days ago. He's
terrific.
He is fantastic.
He works hard. He's smart. And not that I want to take credit for any of this, but he was an intern of mine when I was in the State House in '76 or so.
Wow, that's terrific. He is great. So now let's come to today. Do you want to put on your pundit hat? Do you feel that the Senate can go Democratic in November?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful. I haven't looked at the numbers, and you really got to go through state by state, but it does look like things are trending our way. But if you want to, I think if you watch people like Shields on McNeil, the nightly news on public television, and some of the other folks, you'll get much better information than my guesses as to which states are going to flip. And I think you really won't know till late October how it's going to go. I think the Democrats are going to do very well because I think people have figured out that this president's a faker, not just on how he's handled the economy, taking care of his rich friends, not just his foreign policy disasters from North Korea to the Middle East, but also in how he's handled this pandemic. And the two things I'd like to point out here, and I know the Trump people constantly, oh, well, you're just criticizing. Well, we criticize him because he's done such a terrible job. But one, under a program started by President Obama, they had developed a machine that could make 1.5 million masks a day. And I think Trump's primary driver is anything Obama did, he was against. So even though it was ready to be built by the time he became president, they killed the program. And then President Obama had established a pandemic group to deal with pandemics because, of course, we'd had Ebola and several other major outbreaks, nothing like this. And again, the president dismissed it. And I don't know if you saw, there was a study recently that had we acted even only 2 weeks earlier on locking down the country, we could have saved half the people who died and half the economic impact in the long term. So it's clear he's mishandled this situation in a disastrous way. And it's clear that his foreign policy thing, the peace in North Korea, we gave everything away, we got nothing. In the Middle East, he's made things worse, more dangerous between the Palestinians, the Israelis, and all the people of the region. It's just a disaster of a presidency. And I think more people, as time goes on, will recognize it. And I think that it's sad for the country, but I think it'll turn out to benefit the country long term because hopefully people will have learned their lesson.
Well, it's very scary, Sam, because I look at the polls and I look at some of what the pundits are saying. He's got this 43% like stationary. It doesn't move. If he does something every day, he does something terrible. We would agree. There's a scandal a day, a terrible thing he's said or done, an insult, a disgusting comment, anything that would bring anyone else down. And yet his numbers don't move. His people are not budging.
he's pushed all the buttons. He started with racism against Hispanics. We've had a situation where the president of the United States said about Nazis and neo-Nazis that they were nice people. He's encouraged the worst parts of what America has in it, and he's benefited from that with some political groups. But I'm certainly hopeful that by the time we get to Election Day and people have to make it, that they're tired of this chaos, that they're tired of this destructive behavior. One of my friends said to me that, what do I got to lose? Well, I think he now sees what he had to lose. And I think hopefully America has learned, what they have to lose. If we have a president who doesn't know, isn't willing to learn, doesn't listen to experts, we pay a price for it as a country.
Who do you think Joe Biden should have as his vice president?
Well, my first choice would be Senator Warren of Massachusetts. But I think because there's a Republican governor, and thereby, if she was to get the nomination, she would be replaced by a Republican nominee from that governor because of the way the Senate replacement process works. I think the leading candidate is Kamala Harris. There are lots of capable people, but Kamala Harris has been tested on the campaign trail, didn't end up being a winner, but didn't make any major disastrous actions. She's been a attorney general, a prosecutor, a United States senator. She has a lot of experience in various levels of government. And I think always the most important thing about the vice president is if something happens to the president, are they capable of stepping in to the fray? Good news for Connecticut, former Senator Chris Dodd. I was on a conference, a Zoom meeting with him the other day with some former members. He didn't give us any great insight, but he did say he's working very hard, and he's on the committee that's vetting people for Vice President Biden.
So what I hear about the Warren thing is that, yes, it's true that the governor of Massachusetts is a Republican and would nominate one, but that's only for a short time until they have a special election. And
yeah, but I think we can't afford to waste. I've lost some of your volume. I don't know if somebody's turned you down, but I think it'd be very hard for us to give up a senator, even for a short period of time.
Okay, so let's see what happens. What is your thinking on the Electoral College? Because that's where we know is where Trump is able to thread the needle by just winning a few votes extra in some of those Midwestern states. And we can have a popular vote
that's happened
margin
a couple times now.
It has. So what
Yeah,
do you?
If you could ask your people in the studio to turn your volume up a little, I'm having a little hard time hearing you, and my volume's at max. So I think the Electoral College, it'd be nice to reform it, but I worry about the political process fiddling with it today. Maybe we should just get a lot of our friends to move to South Dakota and some of these small states with 750,000 people or so, and move them in the right direction. But we have to work harder to get those people to vote with us. It'd be nice if you could change the Electoral College, but I think it's a hard one to pull off.
Okay. One more area I want to talk to you about. You were on the beginning of the discussion of health insurance, where the Clintons tried to do something. Now we got to Obamacare, and now Trump is trying to destroy that, and it's in front of the Supreme Court. What's your thinking about how we need to work with the healthcare issue at this point?
Well, Clinton did make a great effort, led by Hillary Clinton, and it was stopped, and a lot of our Democrats had weak knees, and so it didn't get done. The Obama health care wouldn't have passed in the form it's in without Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The Senate Democrats and the president were actually ready to take a much watered down approach, and when they got to Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the room, and they said, they looked to her, and she said, well, I don't know who's going to pass that in the House. We want a real bill. And so we got a real bill, and people poo-pooed it. It wasn't perfect, but it added tens of millions of people to health coverage. And I think this pandemic, if ever there was a lesson that everybody needs universal health care, this is it. Do you want to go into a restaurant
where the people who clean up after you or provide or prepare the food can't afford to go to the doctor when they're sick, can't afford to take a day off when they're sick. The lunacy of thinking that, oh, I'm rich enough, so I have health care, and if poor people don't have it, it's their problem. This pandemic tells us it's everybody's problem. And also, that's why, Obama had the pandemic for, it doesn't stay in your country. It's best to fight the war over there. So we need to work in Africa and Asia and Europe, any place there's a pandemic before it comes here. For our country, every American ought to be covered by health care. You don't want people making decisions about whether they're going in to the restaurant or going into to serve you if they're sick. You want them to be able to go to a doctor and find out if they're safe enough to work. So I think universal health care, whether you do it, I think the easiest thing is actually Joe Biden's approach, because people get so scared and the pressures come from the insurance companies and everybody else. But I think the hospitals are going to figure out they need to have a universal system too, because they got this devastated economically by what was going on. So have what we have. If you want to buy into Medicare, you can buy into Medicare. It's cheaper. It'll be there no matter whether, a lot of people were against what some Democrats were proposing and say, hey, I've got a job and I've got great health care. I don't want Medicare for all. Well, a lot of those people lost their jobs during this pandemic and ended up without coverage. And COBRA is so expensive that a lot of people couldn't afford COBRA. So I think people will hopefully learn that the country's better off if we all have access to health care, not just the wealthy few and the ones in the middle.
All right. And what do you have a prediction about whether the Supreme Court is going to overturn it or keep it?
I don't think they'll overturn it. I think they're afraid to. And I think Roberts will again scuttle the Republican efforts, because the backlash is already, when Obama left office, Obamacare was marginally approved of. Since then, its approval has been going up and up and up. And the Trump administration has never advertised for it, never talked about opening it up, and it just keeps growing because it's a much better system than anything else that's out there.
Okay, great. I want to ask you, give us two more things. What do you miss most about not being in Congress? What was the best thing about being in Congress, and what was the worst thing about being in Congress?
The best thing about being in Congress was the ability to help people. Sometimes on larger issues, somebody comes to you with a problem and you're able to help a large group of people. But sometimes just an individual calls up, has a problem, got caught up in the bureaucracy of things, and you're able to use your office to help that constituent resolve his or her problem. That was a great feeling. Like in any activity, a lot of things are put off in the future. You'd put a bill in, it might take 10 years for that bill to become law. A constituent might come to you and have a problem. You're able to solve it right away. That's a really good feeling. One of the best things about being a member of Congress besides that was information. Anything you wanted to learn, any curiosity you had, you were able to get the information. If you wanted, I had a question once about an economic theory. I called up a Nobel laureate and he answered the phone and we talked for an hour and he explained something that I wasn't really schooled in sufficiently. So whether it was that or defense or international foreign policy or domestic policy, you were able to get real information as quickly as you wanted. And then there were some real joy moments. I don't know if people remember, but people would come to Congress and they'd make presentations. And a lot of times there was 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes you'd be there alone with incredible scientists and people that could explain things that I obviously wasn't paying attention or weren't presented to me when I was in high school or college.
Great. And the worst
thing I think for people is just you didn't have enough time for anything. I mean, there's so many demands. Half the time in Eastern Connecticut, the congressman is not seeing people. He's driving between Groton and Thompson and Ellington back down to the shore because somebody needs you at a meeting for things. So you waste a lot of time, in the car just getting to things. And that was very frustrating. So you might have worked from 6 in the morning till midnight but you only did a handful of meetings because of the distances that you traveled. I once remember running into Chris Dodd at an event in Middletown, and we kind of talked to each other about where we were going. And I said, well, I'm going from here, I'm going to Norwich, and from Norwich, I got a thing in Montville, and then I'm finishing in Groton. And Dodd says, well, you're not going to make Groton. I said, no, I'm really hustling. I'm going to make Groton. Yeah, I got to Groton. It was closed by the time I got there.
All right. So this has been great. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to give? Something that's on your chest you want to get it off?
I'm not a great philosopher. I just say, important thing, and I guess this has helped me through life. My parents survived Hitler and Stalin. Their families got wiped out. And my father was in hiding in the woods for 2 years. And sometimes these people took him into their barn to hide him from the Gestapo and Nazis when they came around. We have challenges in our lives, but not like that. The virus has been a challenge. It's hard on people, but people aren't coming into your house, killing your family. Stick together, pay attention to your friends, take good care of yourself, and work for a better country together. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that note, thank you. You got the last word, Sam. Great to have you on. We'll see everybody the next time on TalkBack. Bye.
Great. Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you.